This family has no place for a disgrace. Get out of my house." My dad, Police Chief Richard Stewart, hissed through his teeth, ruthlessly stripping the coat right off my back. I was 15, 8 weeks pregnant, and being thrown out onto the street in the freezing dead of night. My mom stood there in dead silence. On the stairs, their golden boy, my brother Thomas, sneered, "So, can I take her room then?" They threw me away, pouring every last cent of their wealth into that incompetent fool, utterly convinced I would just collapse and die out there. 20 years later, having burned through $150,000 and drowning in debt, they brazenly tracked me down to claim the firstborn grandson from my blood. They confidently staged a tearful reunion charade right in the middle of the town square. But the moment we locked eyes, his arrogant smile froze completely. What was waiting for them wasn't some easily manipulated grandson. Stepping forward in my immaculate dress blue uniform, my chest gleaming with 4 combat medals, I looked straight into the twitching, terrified eyes of the man who had thrown me away, and coldly smirked. "Major Stewart, the game is over, former police chief. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are." The muscle beneath my dad's left eye was twitching. That same involuntary spasm, that same cold, remorseless stare. I had seen it before. 20 years before, on the night he slammed the front door in my face and locked the deadbolt. I was 15, shivering uncontrollably on the frost-covered porch, clutching a battered old canvas duffel bag that held everything I owned in this world. A pair of jeans with a hole in the left knee, 2 thin cotton shirts, a dog-eared paperback Bible my grandfather had given me the summer before he died, a cracked plastic comb missing 3 teeth, a single photograph of my grandfather in his army dress, uniform crease down the middle from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. That was the sum total of my existence, stuffed into 20 pounds of fraying canvas and desperation. The heavy wooden front door slammed shut behind me. The brass deadbolt clicked into place with a definitive metallic thud that echoed like a gunshot down the silent upper-middle-class suburban street, every house dark, every curtain drawn, not a single porch light flicking on to investigate. I stood on that porch for exactly 3 minutes, my bare hands turning a sickly shade of purple in the freezing air foolishly, waiting for my mom to open the door. I prayed she would crack it open just enough to slip me a blanket, sneak snorts me a few crumpled dollars, whisper that she was sorry. Do absolutely anything that a mother should do for her terrified pregnant child standing alone in the cold. She never came. The hallway light behind the frosted glass panel clicked off. She had gone back to bed. I looked up at the second-floor window, my old bedroom, and watched the unmistakable silhouette of my brother, yanking the heavy curtains shut with a sharp, aggressive pull. He was already claiming his territory, spreading out into my closet, my desk, my space, taking everything I had left before my footprints had even faded from the frost on the porch. The absolute betrayal settled deep into my bones and froze my blood far colder than the winter wind ever could. There was no warmth left in this bloodline. They had surgically removed me from their perfect fraudulent lives. And they had done it with the clinical precision of people who had been discussing this behind closed doors for weeks. I forced my numb, trembling legs to move. I stepped off the wooden porch and onto the icy, unforgiving pavement. 2 miles. I had to walk 2 grueling miles down a pitch-black, winding county highway with absolutely no streetlights, no sidewalks, no reflectors, and no guarantee of anything waiting for me at the other end. Every single step was an agonizing battle against the rising, suffocating tide of panic threatening to drown my sanity. I had no money. I had no phone. I had no future that I could see past the next 100 feet of frozen asphalt. And an 8-week pregnancy weighed on my terrified mind like a slab of wet concrete. The wind howled through the barren trees lining the highway, cutting through my thin cotton shirt like 1,000 microscopic razor blades slicing at my skin. My lungs burned with every shallow breath of freezing air. I clamped my jaws shut and refused to cry. Crying would burn vital calories. It would blur my vision in the pitch darkness, and I needed every single ounce of body heat just to keep the fragile life inside me alive long enough to reach shelter. I focused purely on the rhythmic crunching sound of my cheap, worn-out sneakers hitting the frozen asphalt, using that mechanical beat to suppress the echoing memory of my brother's mocking laughter. I wrapped my arms tight around my stomach, pressing my forearms hard into my ribs, forging an invisible shield out of nothing but bone and willpower, and the stubborn refusal to die on a road that my dad expected to be my grave. If I stopped moving, if I sat down in that snow for even 5 minutes, I would not get back up. The flickering, buzzing neon canopy of a rundown gas station finally appeared at the edge of the town limits. The fluorescent lights cast a sickly pale glow over the empty, cracked parking lot. A dumpster overflowed near the side of the building. The air smelled like old gasoline and frozen mud. I dug into the pockets of my jeans with numb, stiff fingers that refused to bend properly, and scraped together a handful of loose, freezing coins. I did not call my aunts. I did not call my uncles. They worshipped the ground my dad walked on and attended every one of his public speeches with the devotion of true believers. They would have dragged me back to that house for another round of humiliation. And then they would have helped my dad ship me to a home for unwed mothers, 3 states away, where nobody would ever find me. I dropped the coins into the rusty payphone slot, hearing the heavy clunk as they fell into the mechanism. I dialed the only person who had ever treated me with unvarnished, honest respect. My mentor, Margaret Hayes, a gruff, scarred 65-year-old, retired first sergeant I had volunteered with at the local veterans shelter every Saturday for 2 years. She had taught me how to fold bandages, how to inventory a supply closet, and how to look a room full of damaged men in the eye without flinching. She was the only adult in my life who had never lied to me. The phone rang twice. Her voice came through the crackling receiver like gravel scraped across rusted steel. No sweetness, no panic, no dramatic gasp of horror. I did not beg. I did not sob. I did not play the victim. I stated my exact location and my desperate situation in 4 flat sentences, delivering them with the same blunt efficiency she had drilled into me over 2 years of Saturday mornings. She did not offer fake pity. She did not waste time with useless comfort. She issued a single strict tactical directive through the crackling line. Stay right there. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Exactly. 15 minutes later, the blinding headlights of Margaret's rusted, weather-beaten Jeep swept across the gas station parking lot. The vehicle screeched to a halt beside the phone booth gravel, spraying against the curb. She stepped out into the cold, leaving the engine running and the heater blasting. She did not rush over to hug me. She did not coddle my shivering frame or cup my face in her hands. She clinically evaluated my hunched posture from 6 feet away, checking for visible injuries with the practiced eye of a woman who had triaged bleeding soldiers in 3 different wars. She saw the red welt on my neck, where my dad had ripped my coat away. She nodded once, pointed at the passenger seat, and barked a single word that sounded more like a military order than an invitation. I climbed into the fiercely heated cab without a word. The warm air hit my frozen skin so hard it hurt. Hours later, I stood in her impeccably organized military-style guest room. The bed was made with hospital corners, so crisp you could bounce a quarter off the blanket. The walls held 3 framed photographs of her unit in Vietnam, faded to yellow. Every face staring forward with the same iron expression she wore every day of her life. I dug desperately through the bottom of my canvas duffel bag, scraping my fingers along the worn fabric. I was looking for my grandfather's old military dog tag, my only treasured possession, the single piece of metal on this earth that connected me to a man who had loved me without conditions, without performance, without keeping score. It was gone. My mom had taken it. She had reached into my bag while I was being screamed at, while my dad was ripping my coat off my back, and she had quietly slipped the dog tag into the pocket of her bathrobe. She kept it. She hid it away in some drawer or jewelry box, a stolen trophy to soothe her cheap, cowardly conscience while she stood in the hallway and watched her husband banish her pregnant 15-year-old daughter into the freezing night. I clenched my jaw so hard my back teeth ached. I stared into the dark, empty fabric at the bottom of the bag for a long time. Then I straightened my spine. pulling my shoulders back until my posture matched the iron rod rigidity of the woman who had just driven 20 miles in the middle of the night to save my life. I locked my tears away in that moment, permanently. The terrified girl who had stumbled down that frozen highway was dead. She had bled out somewhere between mile marker 1 and mile marker 2, and she was never coming back. The soldier was born right here, in this room, standing over an empty bag, with fists clenched hard enough to turn the knuckles white. Months later, in a sterile hospital room that reeked of bleach and medical-grade alcohol, I gripped the cold steel railing of the delivery bed until the tendons in my forearms stood out like cables. A nurse with a clipboard barked clipped efficient commands from the foot of the bed. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed and flickered with an electrical fault that nobody had bothered to fix. Then my daughter screamed her way into the world. Tiny fists clenched, her face twisted into a furious red-faced scowl that looked exactly like the expression I made when I was holding back rage. I looked down at her and felt something massive detonate inside my chest. Not the soft, warm glow the movies like to sell. This was a detonation, a primal, ferocious certainty that hammered through my exhausted body like a shockwave. No force on this earth would ever do to this child what my family had done to me. There was absolutely no room for weakness anymore. I was the sole architect of her survival, and I would build that architecture out of discipline and steel, and the complete unforgiving elimination of every vulnerability that had ever allowed someone to hurt me. A year after she was born, the day the calendar confirmed I was legally old enough, I walked straight into the local military recruitment office. The recruiter behind the cluttered desk looked me up and down. A skinny teenage single mother with calloused hands, dark circles carved deep under her eyes and a jaw set so tight it looked wired shut. He slid the stock of enlistment papers across the desk, with a skeptical half-smile that told me he gave me 2 weeks in basic before I washed out crying for home. I signed every page with a remarkably steady hand. I locked my eyes on his face and did not blink. I was not there for a paycheck. I was not there for health insurance or a housing allowance. I was there because the United States Army was the only institution on this planet that would take my suppressed rage and forge it into something disciplined, lethal, precise, and genuinely useful. Basic training was an orchestrated, grueling nightmare, designed specifically to break the weak and filter out the fragile before they ever reached a battlefield. I threw myself into the brutal physical conditioning with a terrifying mechanical intensity that unnerved even my most hardened drill sergeants. The punishing 20-mile ruck marches, with 80 elb packs digging furrows into my shoulders. The instructors screaming inches from my face, so close I could map the veins in their temples. The suffocating, freezing mud that coated my uniform from helmet to boot until I could not tell where the earth ended, and my body began. None of it registered as real pain. I had a personal benchmark for suffering, and it was not exhaustion or blistered feet or lungs that burned like hot coals. My benchmark was the sound of a brass deadbolt clicking shut while my mother stood in the hallway and did nothing. I used the vivid memory of my dad's arrogant sneer as premium fuel to push through muscle failure on every single repetition. While other recruits wept quietly in their bunks at night, from sheer physical and mental exhaustion, homesick and broken, I sat perfectly still against the cold concrete wall of the barracks, my back pressed flat against the cinder block. I controlled my breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. I systematically buried every fragment of my past inside a steel vault in my chest and welded the door shut with white-hot discipline. I did not break when they screamed at me. I did not falter when my boots filled with blood during the night march and the medic told me to consider dropping out. I got harder, faster, colder, infinitely more dangerous. The years ground forward with the relentless rhythm of military life. I deployed to volatile combat zones that smelled like diesel fuel, burning rubber, and the copper tang of blood. In a sweltering field hospital with canvas walls that shook from concussive blasts, I pulled a jagged 4-in piece of shrapnel from a 19-year-old private's shoulder while he screamed through a leather strap clenched between his teeth. I stitched a gash across a staff sergeant's abdomen, by flashlight during a generator failure. My hands steady as surgical instruments, while the walls trembled around us and dust rained from the ceiling. I operated in environments where a single moment of panic meant a soldier bled out on the table. Panic was a luxury that belonged to people who had never lost everything at 15. Back home, Margaret stayed rooted like an ancient oak. She raised my daughter with the same military precision and unyielding discipline that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. She taught Chloe how to render a crisp, perfect salute before the girl could properly run across the living room without tripping. She drilled hospital corners into the bed sheets every single morning at 6 a.m. sharp, pulling the fabric taut and bouncing a quarter off the surface until it met her standard. She took my daughter to the veterans cemetery every Memorial Day and taught her to stand at attention in front of each headstone for exactly 10 seconds of silence. She taught my child to look the cruel world dead in the eye, without blinking, without flinching, without ever backing down an inch. Every handwritten letter I received from them in the sweltering desert was a stark, powerful reminder of exactly what I was fighting to protect: a real family, a functional unit bonded by fierce loyalty and genuine sacrifice, completely free of manipulation, conditional love, gaslighting, and the toxic rot of people who only kept you around as long as you were useful to their image. I climbed the military ranks through sheer grit, unmatched tactical efficiency, and flawless execution under fire. I completed advanced medical training. I led field surgical teams in combat theaters. I wrote operational protocols that saved lives in 3 different countries. Eventually, I stood tall in my perfectly tailored uniform and accepted my promotion to major, and the heavy brass oak leaves pinned to my collar should have been the proudest weight I had ever carried. But they felt like lead the day I stood in the freezing pouring rain at Margaret's funeral. The cemetery was silent, except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against black umbrellas and the distant crack of a 7-gun salute. I stood at rigid attention, ignoring the water streaming down my face, delivering a crisp, agonizingly perfect salute as the tightly folded American flag was solemnly presented to me by a young sergeant whose hands trembled slightly. She was gone, buried beneath the wet earth in a plot she had picked out herself next to a Korean War veteran she had never met but said deserved the company. But the legacy she had permanently installed inside my daughter and me was load-bearing. It held up the entire structure of who we were. I adjusted my cover, turned on my heel, and walked away from the grave with a heart converted entirely to titanium. Whatever war came next, my armor was flawless. While I was pulling wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles in a desert 10,000 miles away, my dad was playing God back home. He could not accept the idea that his family legacy might fade from the town's memory. So, he cashed in every dirty political favor he had accumulated over 3 decades as police chief. He strong-armed the local police department into handing my brother a brand new badge and a patrol car. He wanted to parade his golden boy around the town square as the rightful heir, a monument to the Stewart name that everyone was supposed to admire. I read about the appointment on a local community forum, scrolling through the post on my cracked phone screen from the dim light of my deployment tent. I sipped my bitter black coffee and absorbed the information with the clinical detachment of an intelligence officer, reading a threat assessment about a foreign government's internal collapse. A rigged game cannot mask sheer staggering incompetence forever. My brother treated the sacred police uniform not as a duty to protect, but as a VIP pass for petty extortion, laziness, and aggressive bullying. He swaggered through the town square, collecting free meals from intimidated restaurant owners. He pulled over teenage drivers for invented infractions and pocketed the cash they offered to avoid tickets. He showed up to his shifts late, left early, and spent his lunch breaks in the back booth of a bar on 4th Street, running up a tab he never intended to pay. It did not take long for his fraudulent facade to violently shatter. 3 separate complaints were filed against him within 8 months. A local shop owner reported a shakedown. A college student filed a formal harassment claim after being pulled over 4 times in 2 weeks on the same stretch of road for no reason. A retired school teacher caught him sleeping in his patrol car in the church parking lot at 2:00 in the afternoon with an open bottle of bourbon on the passenger seat. Tenal Affairs opened a file. Then the security camera at a gas station on Route 12 recorded him accepting a pathetic roll of cash from a low-level drug runner in exchange for tipping him off about patrol schedules. The footage was grainy, but the badge number on his chest was perfectly legible. The investigation was swift and merciless. They stripped his badge in a public hearing at City Hall, while my dad sat in the back row, with his arms crossed and his jaw locked, refusing to accept what every other person in the room could plainly see. They fired my brother in total humiliating disgrace. The local paper ran the story above the fold, with his booking photo unshaven and glassy-eyed, right next to a file photo of my dad, giving a speech about integrity at the previous year's Community Awards dinner. Rather than holding his son accountable, my dad doubled down on his delusion. He refused to accept that his genetic investment was a catastrophic failure. He stubbornly poured a staggering $150,000 of his own hard-earned retirement savings into launching a heavily advertised private security firm for my brother. A glossy logo, a rented office with leather chairs, business cards with embossed gold lettering, and absolutely no one competent behind the desk. I read the detailed exposé about the scandal in the same online forum from my deployment tent. I sipped my coffee, finished the article, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a chilling clinical indifference to their inevitable destruction. The security company went completely bankrupt within a single year. My brother was fundamentally incapable of doing actual work. He showed up late to client meetings. He alienated every contract within 90 days. He ignored basic logistics like scheduling, invoicing, and maintaining equipment. He burned through the massive cash injection with terrifying speed, draining accounts like a man shoveling money into an open furnace. When the funds ran dry, he turned to illegal high-stakes gambling to maintain his lavish, entitled lifestyle. He sat at backroom poker tables with men who carried knives in their boots and kept accounts in blood. Within months, the favored son was drowning in $85,000 of high-interest debt to ruthless loan sharks who did not care about his dad's former title or his family name or the fancy suit he wore to the table. I read the bankruptcy filing on a forwarded link from a former neighbor. I folded the printout carefully and slipped it into the tactical pocket of my Kevlar vest. The contrast between our two trajectories was absolute and undeniable. I was a highly decorated major, commanding a massive multi-million-dollar medical budget, earning the genuine respect of every soldier under my command, and the trust of 3-star generals. My brother was a paranoid, broke-sweating wreck, jumping at shadows in dive bars, flinching every time a stranger looked at him, waiting for the collectors to come extract their pound of flesh. Their empire was burning to the ground, and they had lit every single match with their own arrogant hands. I locked my metal footlocker, secured my gear, and holstered my sidearm with a definitive heavy click. I remained completely detached from their self-inflicted ruin. They dug their own grave with their greed and their cruelty, and I was not about to hand them a ladder. Several years later, the Pentagon officially assigned me to lead an elite civil-military medical support program. My unit was tasked with deploying directly to underserved rural communities across the country, providing free top-tier medical care to populations that had been abandoned by the civilian healthcare system. Fate, or perhaps a chilling sense of tactical irony, brought my heavily armored convoy directly back to the borders of my hometown. I stepped out of my command vehicle in full combat fatigues, the heavy rubber soles of my boots hitting the familiar cracked pavement of the town square. The same square where I had walked past the bakery as a hungry teenager, too ashamed to beg for scraps. I kept my expression locked in a cold professional mask, betraying absolutely zero emotion. As I scanned the buildings, the storefronts, the faded awnings that had barely changed in 2 decades, I systematically directed my highly trained medical teams, personally treating the aging pillars of the community who had never done me harm. The former firefighter, whose arthritic hands trembled so violently he could barely grip a coffee mug. the two sisters from the local bakery, who used to sneak me warm bread through the back door when I was a hungry kid wandering the streets after school. The old librarian who had let me sleep in the reading room on freezing afternoons, and never once asked me why I did not go home. I treated them all with the same meticulous professional care I had given to wounded soldiers on the battlefield. I was a ghost returning to the scene of the crime, but I returned not as a victim. I returned as a commander, with the power to heal the people my dad had only ever used. My most critical patient during the deployment was Lady Evelyn Vance, 74 years old, the widow of a decorated Army colonel, the undisputed, fiercely respected moral authority of the entire town, a woman whose word carried more weight in this community than any court order or municipal resolution. I treated her chronic respiratory illness in her quiet, heavily draped living room, carefully adjusting her IV drip and monitoring her vitals on a portable unit I had set up beside her wingback chair. She looked at my olive drab uniform with deep, instinctive respect. The kind of respect that only comes from a woman who watched her own husband carry the burden of command for 30 years. She had no idea who I was. She did not recognize the teenage girl who had disappeared from this town 2 decades ago, because that girl no longer existed in any recognizable form. As I checked her blood pressure, the rhythmic hum of the monitor filling the silence between us, Evelyn began to talk. She wanted to tell me a story she thought would resonate with a fellow military soul, a tragic local story that had defined the town's politics and identity for 20 years. She told me how the former police chief, a man named Richard Stewart, had spent 2 decades weeping on stage at every town hall meeting, every fundraiser, every community breakfast. She described multiple speeches in careful detail, her aged voice trembling with the emotion of a woman who had taken those speeches personally, who had prayed for that lost girl every Sunday for 20 years. One speech in particular, a Veterans Day address 3 years after I was thrown out, where he stood at the town podium and wept so convincingly that the mayor's wife fainted in the front row. He told the crowd that his beloved daughter had fallen into sin and darkness, gotten pregnant by a violent criminal connected to a drug syndicate, and vanished willingly into the night, with dangerous people who had corrupted her beyond saving. He claimed he had searched for her desperately, spending his own retirement savings to hire private investigators. He said he had placed missing person ads in regional papers and called hospitals in 4 different states. He told the crowd. He stayed up every night staring at the phone waiting for a call that never came, and that he had set a place for her at the dinner table every Thanksgiving for years, until his wife could not bear the sight of the empty chair anymore. Evelyn's eyes glistened as she recalled how the entire congregation had wept alongside him, how the church had taken up a special collection, how the mayor had dedicated a bench in the town park to the memory of the lost Stewart girl. Every word of it was a fabricated, carefully rehearsed lie. He had painted himself as the grieving noble father. He harvested the town's collective pity like a seasonal crop, reaping sympathy donations, political endorsements, and a level of community protection that made him untouchable. He manipulated the mayor into repeatedly using my downfall as a moral cautionary tale during Sunday services. He used my exile, my suffering, my stolen name to secure continuous re-election for 15 straight years. He stole my trauma, twisted it into a sickening theatrical performance, and wore my banishment like a badge of honor to feed his endless, insatiable, narcissistic ego. Every tear he shed in public was a calculated investment to hide the monster he truly was. I did not flinch, my hand did not shake. I did not drop the IV bag. My heart rate remained at a terrifyingly steady 62 beats per minute. I simply nodded, offered Evelyn a reassuring professional smile, and absorbed the sheer magnitude of his sickening audacity without breaking my cover for a single second. Inside my chest, the steel vault where I kept my rage hummed like a reactor core. But the door held. I stepped out of her house onto the sunlit porch. I stood perfectly still for 10 seconds, feeling the warmth on my face, processing the tactical implications of what I had just learned. Then, I pulled my tactical radio from my belt, pressed the push-to-talk button with my gloved thumb, and contacted Captain Sarah Jenkins, my second in command. I gave her a single precise directive, not as a classified military order, but as a personal request to a trusted intelligence officer. Sarah, pull every piece of open-source data on Police Chief Richard Stewart, I instructed softly into the radio. Campaign speeches, newspaper quotes, public financial dealings, and community donation records over the last 20 years. Leave no public archive unchecked and have the dossier on my desk in 6 weeks. I was weaving a net, microscopic thread by microscopic thread, and I would let him walk right into it, completely blind to the sniper, who had already zeroed her scope on his reputation. Months later, the quiet rhythm of my field office was shattered by the harsh buzzing of my base office line. An out-of-state civilian number blinked aggressively on the console. I picked up the heavy receiver, maintained absolute silence, and let the caller speak first to reveal their position. Standard operating procedure. A voice slithered through the speaker. Greasy, desperately warm, dripping with a sickeningly sweet nasal affection that made the skin on my forearms crawl with instant visceral revulsion. Hello, little sister, my brother. He had somehow discovered my rank, my assignment, the fact that I controlled massive government medical budgets, and the rumor that I had a child. His voice poured through the receiver like cheap syrup, attempting to bridge a 20-year canyon of absolute cruelty with hollow fake familial charm. He spoke to me as if we had talked just last week, as if the freezing night, the locked door, the stolen dog tags, the mocking laughter on the stairs were all just a minor misunderstanding that a quick phone call could smooth over. He babbled into the receiver words, tumbling over each other in a breathless, panicked stream. He missed me so much. The family was incomplete without me. Old wounds needed healing. The word family kept appearing in every sentence like a mantra he believed would unlock my wallet if he repeated it enough times. I leaned back in my leather tactical chair, staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles clinically dissecting every micro-tremor in his voice. The loan sharks were closing in. His phone calls to old friends had been rejected. His credit cards were maxed. The only ATM left was the sister he had helped throw into the snow when she was 8 weeks pregnant. When his cheap charm failed to crack my stony silence, the panic set in. I could hear his breathing accelerate, the wet sound of him licking his dry lips. He fumbled the receiver, and then a different voice filled the line, deeper, booming, dripping with the authoritative resonance of a man who still believed his former title granted him divine power over everyone he addressed. My dad. He adopted his proud patriarch voice, expressing profound concern for my military career, as if he had followed it with fatherly devotion instead of total deliberate ignorance. He pivoted the conversation with the practiced skill of a politician, expressing a burning, desperate desire to finally meet his firstborn grandson, the mythical boy he fully intended to mold into the police dynasty heir that my brother had so catastrophically failed to become. I let them talk. I listened to the sheer, pathetic desperation leaking through their crumbling facades like water through a rusted hull. They were completely transparent. Every word was driven by greed and survival, not by love or remorse. When my brother grabbed the receiver back and started pathetically fumbling through a clumsy pitch about borrowing a small sum to handle a temporary situation with some really bad people, his voice cracking and breaking mid-sentence like a teenager asking for lunch money, I pressed my finger down hard on the receiver hook. The line went dead. I let the silence hang in my office for exactly 60 seconds, staring at the phone on my desk. They wanted my money to save their miserable self-inflicted ruin. They wanted a male heir to salvage their shattered legacy. They wanted salvation from the very monster they had created by throwing me away. They would receive absolutely none of it. I picked the phone back up. I punched in the caller ID number and dialed. My dad answered on the first ring, panting with barely concealed anxiety, his breathing so heavy I could hear it rattling in his chest. I did not offer a single dollar. I did not offer a syllable of comfort. Instead, I used a voice as cold, sharp, and sterile as a surgical scalpel, and I issued a formal invitation. I told him to bring the entire family to the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony at the town military field base. I promised him with chilling calm that if he showed up, he would see exactly what I had produced with my life. I hung up without waiting for his response, setting the crosshairs directly on his fragile, crumbling public empire. The trap was perfectly baited, and his ego guaranteed he would walk right into it. If you have ever felt the sting of toxic relatives, only reaching out when they need to use you financially, please take a moment to like this video. It reminds us we are not alone. So, share your own experience in the comments below about setting boundaries with manipulative family members. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I summoned my daughter to my private office on the base. She entered in her immaculate, perfectly pressed gray West Point cadet uniform, her posture rigid as a steel beam, her eyes sharp and assessing the room before she even sat down. She lowered herself into the chair across from my desk, with her hands folded precisely in her lap, still as a loaded weapon with the safety engaged, waiting for the briefing. I slid a yellowed 20-year-old newspaper, clipping across the glass desktop toward her. The headline featured my dad's face, contorted into a theatrical, perfectly rehearsed expression of grief, with the caption quoting him about his lost daughter. I tapped the photograph once with my index finger and looked my daughter dead in the eye. My voice laced with the controlled venom of a woman who had waited 2 decades to say these words to the one person who deserved to hear them. He never came looking for me, never felt an ounce of remorse. He used your life and my honor to build a fake monument for himself. I watched her process the magnitude of the betrayal. The muscles in her jaw tightened, her nostrils flared once a sharp intake of air through her nose. Her fingers pressed harder into her lap, but there was no trembling lip, no fragile shock, no tearful breakdown or desperate questions. The fierce, uncompromising fire of a future combat commander ignited behind her dark, steady eyes. She despised hypocrisy with the exact same lethal intensity I did. It was in her blood, the good blood, the blood Margaret had tempered and refined. She stood up from the chair, squaring her broad shoulders, and locked her gaze onto mine with absolute authority. I'm going with you to the ceremony. I want them to see the consequences of their cruel decisions with their own eyes. My chest swelled with an immense quiet pride that I kept locked behind my expression. She was a titanium fortress, completely immune to emotional manipulation. They had wanted a grandson they could corrupt and mold into a badge-carrying puppet. Instead, they were going to face a cadet, forged in iron, who would look through them like they were made of glass. A few days later, Captain Sarah Jenkins marched into my office and slammed a thick 6-page intelligence report onto my desk with enough force to rattle the coffee mug. It was a masterpiece of forensic evidence, sworn witness testimonies from town residents who had attended his speeches, hidden financial records tracing the flow of political donations directly into personal accounts, medical logs from the county hospital documenting the night a 15-year-old pregnant minor was admitted with hypothermia and no guardian present. 20 years of fraud, corruption, and calculated emotional exploitation laid out in damning black ink on crisp white paper. Sarah leaned across the desk, her eyes burning with barely restrained fury, and urged me to submit it immediately through the chain of command. A clean, legal, bureaucratic kill shot that would obliterate his reputation without ever stepping into a public arena. My brother's voicemails were stacking up on my phone in the corner of the desk, the red light blinking in frantic intervals. Each message was more pathetic than the last, sobbing, begging, promising anything, swearing he would change, swearing he would never ask again if I would just wire him enough to keep the loan sharks from putting him in the hospital. I glanced at the blinking light, then back at the stack of evidence that held the power to end my dad's existence with a single signature. I picked up the thick report. Sarah watched me, already reaching for the pen on my desk to witness my signature. I walked past her straight to the heavy-duty paper shredder, bolted to the floor in the corner of my office. I fed the first page into the steel teeth. The machine snarled, ripping the paper apart with a violent grinding screech. "Major, what are you doing? That's our fatal blow." Sarah lunged forward, her hand reaching for the remaining pages, her face twisted in absolute horrified disbelief. I blocked her path with my shoulder and continued feeding document after document into the grinding jaws. His sworn testimonies, his hidden financial records, his medical logs, his carefully catalogued lies. All of it shredded into meaningless white confetti that piled up at my boots like fake snow. Sarah stood behind me, breathing hard, her fists clenched at her sides, unable to comprehend what she was watching. I turned to face her, my expression completely hollowed of mercy, emptied of doubt, stripped down to the bare titanium beneath. Let the truth speak for itself, Captain. I was not going to fight him with paperwork in a closed courtroom, where nobody would see it, where the records would be sealed, and the public would never know. I was going to let his own blind, self-destructive arrogance carry him onto a public stage in front of every single person he had ever deceived, and let the truth detonate in his face like a landmine he had buried with his own hands. The morning of the Veterans Day ceremony arrived under a hard, clear sky. The town square had been transformed into a fortress of military precision. Armored vehicles flanked the perimeter. Troop formations stood in crisp, disciplined rows. From my position near the steel stairs of the main stage, I spotted them immediately. My dad strode through the dense crowd like a conquering king surveying his peasants. Expensive suit paid for by the town's sympathy donations. His chin lifted, his shoulders thrown back, his entire body practically vibrating with the smug anticipation of a man who believed he was about to walk into the greatest public relations coup of his life. My mom trailed behind him like a frightened, silent ghost, clutching her purse with both white-knuckled hands. My brother was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning every face in the crowd, hunting for the sister who was supposed to act as his personal financial rescue operation. My dad pushed aggressively through the throngs of citizens, craning his neck scanning faces. He was looking for a boy, a robust, impressionable teenage grandson he could mold, corrupt, and parade around town as the living proof that the Stewart dynasty still had a future. Then he spotted me standing near the podium. His rehearsed smile stretched wide across his flushed face. His eyes shifted to the figure standing at my immediate right. The smile shattered like glass hitting concrete. Cadet Chloe Stewart stood at perfect rigid attention in her heavy gray West Point uniform. Her chin was level. Her shoulders were square. Her dark eyes locked forward with the flat, assessing stare of a young woman who had been trained to evaluate threats before they materialized. She did not smile. She did not wave. She did not reach out for a hug, or a handshake, or a single gesture of filial warmth. She stared straight through him like he was an irrelevant, disgusting obstacle on the pavement that did not even warrant the effort of stepping around. The shock hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward half a step, bumping into my mom. His jaw went slack. His eyes darted between my daughter and me, his brain short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the grandson he had fantasized about with the lethal, composed young soldier standing before him, in pressed gray wool. I had not raised a victim. I had not raised a puppet. I had raised an apex predator, and she was looking at him the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. Before he could recover or utter a single syllable of his rehearsed script, the PA system whined with a sharp burst of feedback. Colonel Mitchell, the supreme commanding officer of the region, stepped up to the podium, silencing the entire murmuring crowd with his sheer commanding presence. His booming voice cut through the morning air like an artillery shot. He spoke of selflessness, tactical brilliance, and the grueling, often invisible sacrifice of military medical personnel who saved civilian lives in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Then he loudly announced my name, my rank, and my complete record of service, awarding me the military's highest medal for civil military medical excellence. The applause erupted instantly, deafening, thunderous, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the square and drowned out everything else. The baker, the librarian, the firefighter with the shaking hands, Evelyn Vance in the VIP section, the mayor, they all rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor that shook the bleachers. The town roared for me, and the sound completely buried the horrified, suffocating realization spreading across my family's faces in the front row. I adjusted the collar of my heavily decorated dress blue jacket. I felt the weight of every single medal pinned to my chest. I marched up the steel steps to the podium, with perfect measured cadence, my boots ringing against the metal in the absolute silence that fell over the stage. The colonel pinned the gleaming metal to my chest and stepped back. I turned slowly to face the massive crowd. My eyes found one target, only one: my dad. Standing in the front row, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and wrinkled and ridiculous. I stared down at him from the absolute peak of military glory, and the contrast was devastating. I was a titan of discipline and earned honor. He was crumbling, desperate fraud in a suit, bought with stolen sympathy. The crushing psychological weight of my gaze pinned him to the dirt, suffocating his ego before I even opened my mouth. The instant Colonel Mitchell stepped back from the podium, my dad snapped. He was completely incapable of letting someone else hold the spotlight. Utterly desperate to hijack my hard-earned moment for his own twisted narrative, he shoved his way through the front row, ignoring the shocked shouts of the military security detail, and charged up the steel stairs. He snatched the microphone from the stand, causing a harsh, ear-piercing squeal of feedback to echo over the entire square. He forced a sickeningly fake, tearful expression onto his flushed, sweating face. He shifted into his victim persona, the one he had rehearsed in bathroom mirrors for 20 years. He opened his mouth, fully prepared to launch into his script of the heartbroken father, welcoming home his lost, sinful daughter. One last manipulation, one final performance to save everything. He did not get a single word out. From the front row of the VIP section, Lady Evelyn Vance shot to her feet with shocking speed. She grabbed a secondary microphone from a startled event staff member, and her voice thundered across the square with devastating, unquestionable moral authority. "Stop this cheap, stinking charade right now, Richard." The entire crowd froze. Every mouth closed. Every pair of eyes locked onto the 74-year-old widow, standing in the front row, her trembling finger aimed at my dad's chest like the barrel of a rifle. Evelyn's voice did not waver. She had buried a war hero. She had survived 50 years of military life. She had earned the right to judge every soul in this town, and she wielded that authority now like a weapon. She systematically and brutally dismantled his 20-year lie in front of every person who had ever believed it. She described the freezing night in vivid, precise detail. A terrified, 15-year-old pregnant girl thrown onto the porch, with the coat stripped from her back. A door locked behind her by her own father. A mother who stood in the hallway and watched it happen. She told them about the bench in the park dedicated to a lost girl who was never lost at all, just discarded. She recounted his tearful speeches word for word, the ones she had sat through, and wept at the ones that had made her donate her own pension money to his political campaigns. She told the crowd that the woman standing on that stage in a dress blue uniform, the woman who had treated her illness with gentle hands and military precision, was the very same girl he had thrown away, that she had not run off with criminals. She had not vanished into sin. She had been banished by her own father and had clawed her way to the top of the United States Army entirely alone. She ripped his mask off in broad daylight, stripping him bare in front of every single person he had ever deceived. Cornered, utterly exposed. Standing on a stage in front of the mayor, the town council, and hundreds of citizens he had spent decades carefully manipulating, my dad lost his mind. His face turned a dark, dangerous shade of purple. His entire body shook with uncontrollable rage. In a blind, frantic panic to defend his shattered ego, he screamed directly into the live microphone, his voice cracking like breaking glass. "So, what a prestigious police family couldn't harbor a pregnant stray who would stain my reputation?" A horrifying collective gasp ripped through the massive crowd, hundreds of people inhaling sharply at the same time, a sound that cut through the square like a blade. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy, thick with absolute shock and revulsion. The veterans in the crowd stood first, then the bakers, the firefighter, the librarian, the mayor. One by one, then in groups, then all at once they rose to their feet and turned their backs on him. They formed a thick, impenetrable human wall of flesh and uniform between him and me. Not a shout, not a thrown object, just the devastating, unified silence of an entire community turning away from a man they would never look at again. I stepped up to the podium. I smoothly pulled the microphone from his trembling, sweating hand. He did not resist. There was nothing left in him to resist with. I looked down at the hyperventilating, utterly ruined man who had once terrorized my childhood nightmares, and I felt nothing but the cold, clean clarity of a mission reaching its final objective. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not demand an apology. You didn't lose me. You personally kicked a future major out onto the street to raise a criminal. You chose the wrong person. His legs buckled. He collapsed to his knees on the wooden stage, staring blankly into the crowd that had just condemned him with their turned backs. His political empire, his financial empire, his social standing, his identity, 20 years of careful parasitic construction vaporized into dust by his own toxic public confession. The town watched him break, and not a single person moved to help him stand. Late afternoon arrived, casting a golden light over the aftermath. The town had completely ostracized my parents and my brother. No one would look at them. No one would speak to them. They stood in a pathetic, isolated cluster near the perimeter fence, surrounded by empty space. I walked toward my armored command vehicle, with measured, unhurried steps, my boots crunching on the gravel. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the clearing-out area, and the air smelled like diesel exhaust and freshly cut grass. My mom intercepted me near the perimeter fence. She stepped directly into my path, her body hunched forward, her shoulders curled inward like a woman bracing for a blow she knew she deserved. Her eyes were swollen red and raw from hours of continuous crying. Mascara had streaked down her cheeks in dark, ugly lines. Her trembling, hesitant hands held out a small, tarnished object, my grandfather's military dog tag. The chain was tangled, and the engraving was worn, nearly smooth from years of being handled, rubbed between nervous fingers, in private moments when her guilt must have kept her awake at night. The dog tag she had maliciously stolen from my bag 20 years ago. She was trying to buy my forgiveness with a useless piece of cold metal, praying desperately for a shred of the maternal bond she had willingly surrendered on the night she chose silence over her own daughter's survival. I did not reach for it. I raised my gloved hand and swatted the dog tag away. It hit the cracked asphalt with a pathetic hollow clink, spinning into the dirt near her shoe. I looked her dead in the eye. I once craved this on the coldest night of my life, but it doesn't belong to me anymore. Your cowardice never deserves forgiveness. I stepped past her hunched, weeping form and felt lighter than I had in 20 years. Her tears meant nothing to a soldier who was forged in the freezing fire of her deliberate neglect. My brother intercepted me next. He came stumbling across the gravel parking lot, his expensive loafers scuffing on the uneven ground, grabbing frantically at the crisp fabric of my uniform sleeve with both hands. His snort's fingers dug into the wool like he was clinging to the edge of a cliff. Every trace of his former arrogance, every ounce of the golden boy swagger that had defined his entire worthless existence was gone. He was openly sobbing, snot running down his upper lip, his face blotchy and swollen. He was terrified. Not of me. Of the men who were going to come for him, now that his final hope of rescue had publicly disintegrated in front of the entire town. He begged me to pay off his gambling debt because we are family. He said the word family 3 times in a single sentence, each repetition more desperate and hollow than the last. I stopped walking. I looked slowly, deliberately down at his gripping hand on my sleeve, with the kind of terrifying, glacial intensity that I had used to silence insubordinate soldiers in combat zones. The kind of stare that does not threaten violence, but promises something far worse. Absolute permanent indifference. His fingers loosened. His entire body shrank backward like a dog caught stealing from the table, his shoulders collapsing inward, his chin dropping to his chest. Family isn't an excuse to be a parasite. Deal with it yourself, you pathetic former cop. I did not give him a dime. I did not give him a single ounce of pity. I left him standing there with his mouth open, and his hand still raised in the empty air where my sleeve had been. My daughter was already sitting in the passenger seat of our armored SUV, her posture perfect, a subtle, proud smile resting on her lips. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy armored door shut. The thick steel cut off my mom's wailing mid-sob, sealing the sound outside, like it belonged to a world I was leaving behind forever. I turned the ignition, The massive engine roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards and up through the heavy soles of my boots. I pressed my boot down on the gas and accelerated out of the town limits without checking the rearview mirror. Not once. If you believe that true family is built on respect and sacrifice, rather than toxic bloodlines, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts below on how you found the strength to walk away from toxic people and build your own beautiful life.